They slept sitting up. That's right, propped against pillows or wooden boards, like corpses in a church painting. They believed lying flat was one step too close to death, and that sleeping upright allowed for better digestion, less demon entry, and easier breathing. But that's just scratching the surface. Some people slept fully dressed, with knives under their pillows and garlic hanging from the rafters. Others didn't sleep at all in the way we do. They split the night into two distinct chunks, waking up in the middle to pray, talk, eat, or make more children. Hello and welcome. If you're new here, I'm glad you found your way to this quiet corner of strange history. This is a place where the forgotten details of the old world come back to whisper. If you enjoy slipping into stories that sit somewhere between eerie and enlightening, you might want to subscribe, and let yourself drift into sleep with a little bit of the weird. Let's begin. We take sleep for granted. Soft pillows, blackout curtains, 8-hour schedules. But sleep, as we know it, is a modern luxury. For medieval people, nighttime was something else entirely. It wasn't restful. It wasn't peaceful. It was a time of vulnerability, danger, and, oddly, obligation. And the way they approached it tells us more about their world than almost anything else. Let's start with the basics. If you lived in the 1300s and you were poor, which most people were, your bed wasn't really a bed. It was more like a pile. Straw, cloth, maybe a bit of wool if you were lucky, laid out in a corner of the single room you shared with your family, your animals, and the damp breath of winter creeping through the cracks in the wall. Mattresses were stuffed with hay, leaves, even pea pods, and they crawled, yes, literally, with bugs. Hence the phrase, "Don't let the bed bugs bite." If you were better off, you might have a wooden bed frame with ropes or slats stretched across to support a mattress. But comfort was still relative. Pillows were a luxury. Blankets were heavy wool or animal hides. Sheets, if you had any, weren't washed often. They smelled like sweat, smoke, and earth. And then there was the matter of what you wore to sleep. Forget pajamas. Nightshirts existed, especially among the wealthier classes, but most people simply slept in their underclothes, or fully dressed. Why? Because heat was precious. Taking off clothes meant more exposure to the cold, and in a time when a winter illness could kill you, staying warm mattered more than comfort. Some even wore hats to bed, not for style, but to keep their heads from freezing. But sleeping arrangements weren't just practical, they were also social. In medieval inns and hostels, travelers often shared beds with strangers. Imagine renting a room and finding not one but 2 or 3 people already sleeping in it, feet to feet or side by side, huddled together for warmth. Complaining wasn't an option. Privacy wasn't a thing. And in peasant homes, entire families shared the same bed. Parents, children, even newborns, all under one blanket, one rhythm of breath. Still, the most bizarre thing wasn't how people slept. It was when. The modern 8-hour sleep block is a relatively recent invention. In the Middle Ages, people followed what's now called a segmented sleep pattern. You'd go to bed shortly after sunset, maybe 8 or 9 p.m., and sleep for a few hours. Then you'd wake up around midnight. This period was called the watch, or first waking, and it wasn't considered insomnia. It was expected. People would get up, tend the fire, use the privy, say prayers. Some read scripture, some made love. Others simply reflected in silence. Then, after an hour or two, they'd return to sleep, the second sleep, until dawn. In fact, some of the earliest written references to this pattern come from medieval medical texts that suggested the time between sleeps was ideal for digestion and conception. But why did they do it? The answer lies partly in the body and partly in the dark. Without artificial light, people's circadian rhythms were closely tied to the sun. Melatonin production began as daylight faded, pulling them into early slumber. But also, segmented sleep matched the patterns of firewood economy and safety. Fires had to be monitored, and sleeping too deeply could mean burning down your house. Waking in the middle of the night allowed for a check-in, a ritual, a pause in vulnerability. Yet, for all this structure, the night was not a peaceful friend. It was full of danger, real and imagined, and those fears shaped how and where people chose to sleep. Before bed, there were rituals, not just religious prayers, though those were common, but gestures, habits, and little movements repeated each night to keep the darkness at bay. Because sleep wasn't just about rest. It was about survival. Medieval people feared the night, not just because of what might lurk outside, but because they truly believed that evil could seep in while they slept. Sleep meant lowering one's guard, physically, spiritually, even morally. So, preparation for sleep became a daily defense. Let's start with something simple: the bed itself. If you could afford it, your bed was high off the ground, not for grandeur, but for protection. Rats, insects, and the cold air of stone floors were all more active below knee level. Children, often considered more vulnerable, were placed in cradles that rocked not just to soothe them, but to keep them off the ground where drafts and pests roamed freely. Then there was the headboard. In some cultures, particularly in Northern Europe, beds were positioned with the head against a wall, and often in a specific direction, ideally facing east, towards Jerusalem, or simply away from doors and windows. It was believed that evil spirits entered from open spaces, so the bed had to be shielded from direct paths of intrusion. Candles were snuffed deliberately, sometimes with whispered charms. Beds were covered not just with blankets, but with additional layers: canopies, curtains, and cloths, not for aesthetics, but as protection. Four-poster beds with heavy drapes weren't symbols of wealth alone. They were fortresses, a way to insulate not just from the cold, but from the things that couldn't be seen. If you lived in a city, the night was noisy. Drunks, thieves, and stray animals wandered the streets. Some houses had barred shutters or small wooden pegs wedged into windows to keep them sealed. Others had bells or string traps attached to doors, makeshift alarms in case of intruders. The poor didn't always have that luxury. They slept with one eye open or with a stick nearby. One curious habit was sleeping with knives under the pillow. These weren't just weapons, they were also amulets. Iron, in particular, was believed to ward off evil, so a knife served double duty, to fight off a thief or to repel witches. Some people placed herbs or garlic near the bed. Others drew crosses in ash on the doorframe or kept pieces of iron under the mattress. For children, the rituals were even more elaborate. Lullabies often doubled as protective spells. The rockabye kind of songs we know today are tame compared to what was sung then. They spoke of angels, of devils at the window, of the Virgin Mary watching over the child. They weren't just meant to soothe, they were meant to shield. But not all fear came from superstition. Real threats were everywhere. Fire was one of the biggest dangers. A single overturned candle, a spark from the hearth, could destroy an entire street of timber-framed homes. That's why fires were often put out deliberately before sleep, smothered with lids or covered in ash. Still, many people left a small ember burning, believing it offered the protection from the dark. And then there were animals. Dogs, especially, played an important role. They weren't just companions, they were alarms. A dog sleeping by the hearth could warn of approaching strangers or strange sounds. Cats were trickier. In some regions, they were seen as protectors against mice and rats. In others, they were associated with witchcraft. Still, many families let cats curl up near the fire, both for warmth and for their alertness. Inside monasteries and religious communities, the approach to sleep was different, but no less complex. Monks and nuns adhered to strict sleep schedules, often broken by nightly prayers called vigils or matins. Their beds were hard, their rooms cold. They slept in silence, sometimes even in open dormitories with no privacy. But even here, rules dictated how one lay down, how one breathed, even what thoughts one should have before sleep. Medical texts of the time offered additional advice. According to one 13th century manuscript, sleep on your right side first, then turn to your left. This helped digestion and prevented nightmares. Don't sleep on your back, lest the devil perch on your chest and paralyze you. Don't sleep with your head uncovered. Evil enters through the crown. And never, ever sleep after eating onions. They invite demons. Not all of this was taken seriously. Some people followed the rules out of habit, others out of fear. But fear was a common denominator. Fear of death in the night, fear of bad dreams, fear of never waking up. Sleep was not an escape. It was a risk. Even those who didn't believe in spirits knew the dangers of thieves, sickness, or sudden accidents. So sleep was always a negotiation. How much rest could you allow yourself before becoming too vulnerable? How tightly could you close your eyes and still feel safe? It's hard to overstate just how uneasy people were about the night, and it's this fear, combined with a sense of daily ritual, that shaped how they approached their most basic human need: rest. Let's imagine the moment the candles go out. The room is quiet. The fire has burned down to coals. Shadows settle into corners. This is when the real night begins. Not just darkness, but something heavier, something closer to the edge of the world. And for medieval people, this wasn't poetic. It was literal. Because night was when the veil between things, between body and spirit, safety and danger, even life and death, felt thinnest. Fear of the night wasn't just cultural, it was visceral. Darkness wasn't romantic, it was unknowable, and what couldn't be seen couldn't be trusted. So people created a framework of habits, prayers, and objects to keep that fear at arm's length. These weren't just customs, they were armor. The Catholic Church taught that night was when temptation crept in, that demons whispered in dreams, that unclean spirits roamed freely while the righteous slept. And though not everyone believed every word, the idea stuck. You didn't want to die in your sleep with unconfessed sins. You didn't want to dream something wicked and wake up thinking it meant something. That's why many people fell asleep clutching prayer beads, or with Latin verses whispered under their breath. The idea was simple. If death came during the night, and it often did, you should be spiritually ready. Then there was the matter of breath. Yes, breath. Medieval people believed that sleep left your body open. Your mouth, especially, was vulnerable. Evil could enter through it, or worse, your soul could escape. Some slept with cloth tied gently across their mouths. Others placed small objects, like dried herbs or pressed crosses, on their chests to anchor their souls. It sounds strange, but consider the context. When you don't understand why people die in the night, you look for ways to stop it. And dreams. Those too were dangerous. In an age without scientific explanations for the subconscious, dreams were messages, warnings, temptations, or omens. A dream about falling could mean demonic attack. A dream of water meant illness. A dream of someone already dead. That was a sign. They were calling you. People didn't wake up and say, "That was weird." They asked questions. They sought meaning. They went to priests, herbalists, and folk healers to interpret what they saw. Some carried dream books filled with symbols and translations. Others recited prayers before sleeping to block bad visions. Even sleep posture mattered. Lying on your back could invite nightmare. Not just a bad dream, but a malevolent spirit that sat on your chest and crushed your breath. Modern scientists recognize this now as sleep paralysis. But medieval people had no such framework, so they explained it through stories. That's where the word nightmare comes from. Mare being a dark spirit that rides you in your sleep. If you experienced it, it wasn't imagined. It was an attack. Now, outside the spiritual fears, there were very real threats. Thieves often struck at night, especially in rural areas where families lived far apart. Doors were bolted. Furniture was pushed in front of entrances. Dogs were not just companions. They were the alarm system. Bandits, ex-soldiers, and the desperate sometimes wandered from village to village. A sleeping house was a perfect target. Quiet, vulnerable. Many people kept crude weapons by their beds. Axes, clubs, even scythes. Not for farming, but for defense. Then there were the fires. Chimneys clogged. Sparks escaped. Candles tipped. Entire towns had been lost to a single unwatched flame. That's why families passed down bedtime fire rituals, ways of covering embers, ways of stacking logs that smoldered instead of flared. Children were taught early. Never sleep with a candle burning. Never hang cloth near the hearth. Never ignore the smell of smoke. And yet, people had to sleep. Fear or not. Life demanded it. So, what do you do when sleep is necessary, but danger is constant? You compromise. In castles and manor houses, guards walked the corridors at night. In towns, watchmen patrolled the streets with lanterns, calling out the hours and checking for smoke or movement. In villages, neighbors agreed to wake each other if something went wrong. Bells were kept close. Dogs trained to bark at the slightest sound, and in monasteries, a different system ruled. There, the fear was less about demons and more about discipline. Monks slept in shifts. They rose at fixed times for prayer. Silence was enforced, even in sleep. Beds were spaced evenly. Clothes were laid out for quick dressing. Every detail was part of a divine schedule. Even their dreams were monitored. If a monk reported troubling visions, it wasn't ignored. He might be asked to fast, to pray more, to sleep on the floor. Because dreams were seen as reflections of the soul, and the soul had to be clean. The idea of sleeping through the night without interruption wasn't just uncommon. It was considered unnatural. Something was wrong if you didn't wake up at least once. That's why the first sleep and second sleep system became so culturally embedded. It wasn't a problem. It was structure. It offered time for reflection, for reading, for checking that the barn hadn't burned down, for staring into the fire and wondering what the next day would bring. Sleep was not rest. It was preparation for the next danger, the next burden, the next round of fears, and through it all people held to small comforts, a warm stone at their feet, a whispered prayer, the slow rhythm of breathing beside them. Because even in fear, the body still longed to drift. Now we arrive at one of the strangest and most forgotten aspects of medieval sleep: segmented sleep, or as some historians now call it, biphasic sleep. You see, for centuries, people didn't expect to sleep in one uninterrupted block. That's a modern invention shaped by artificial lighting, rigid work schedules, and the idea of 8 hours straight. In the Middle Ages, the night was broken, deliberately, predictably, and people adjusted their lives around it. The first sleep, called primo somno in Latin, would begin a few hours after sunset. That meant around 8 or 9 p.m., depending on the season. People would sleep for roughly 4 hours. Then they'd wake up. Not just toss and turn, not just shift in bed, but wake fully. Light a candle. Speak to one another. Tend to the hearth. Pray. Walk. Think. This period between the two sleeps usually lasted 1 to 2 hours. In some households, it was called the watch. In others, it was simply the waking. Then, after that quiet interval, people would return to bed for their second sleep, secundo somno, until dawn. Medical texts of the time didn't just acknowledge this, they encouraged it. A 15th century physician wrote that the time between sleeps was when the body digested best, when the mind was most clear, and when the soul was most receptive to divine messages. It was even considered the ideal time for conception, since the body was rested but still warm. And this wasn't just theory. Literature from the period is full of casual references to first and second sleep. Characters in plays and poems are often found up and active in the middle of the night, writing, talking, praying, even farming. One 13th century farming manual advised that if you must rise to check the animals, do so after first sleep, not before. Why did this happen? The answer lies in darkness and in fire. Without electric lights, people's exposure to illumination was tied directly to the sun. As evening fell, they would light a fire or candles, but both were costly. Wax and oil weren't cheap, and firewood had to be chopped, dried, stored. Most households let the dark come naturally. That meant they fell asleep early, and their melatonin levels responded accordingly. Then, after several hours, their internal clocks nudged them awake. It wasn't insomnia. It wasn't a problem to be fixed. It was simply part of life. In fact, many people cherished that midnight window. It offered privacy, something rare in large families and small homes, a chance to whisper, to reflect, to enjoy a moment without children crying, animals stirring, or neighbors interrupting. For religious communities, the waking hour was sacred. Monks and nuns used it for matins. Early morning prayers often held around 2 or 3 a.m. Their entire daily structure revolved around multiple awakenings, spaced evenly through the day and night. Even outside monasteries, devout lay people sometimes tried to mirror this rhythm, rising to recite psalms or to simply sit in silence. In some noble households, the watch hour was social. Letters were written, books were read, couples talked. In fact, the phrase first sleep appears in many love letters and romantic poems of the period, often as a time to meet secretly or exchange messages while others rested. And in rural communities, the break in sleep offered a moment for tending animals, checking on fires, or doing quiet household chores. In winter, it might mean feeding the stove. In summer, walking out to check the fields or ensure no predators had disturbed the livestock. It's worth pausing to imagine that kind of world. A world where waking up at 1 a.m. didn't feel wrong, where silence wasn't eerie, it was ordinary, where your neighbors might also be up, sipping a weak beer or muttering a prayer to the Virgin. The middle of the night wasn't feared. It was familiar. Of course, not everyone loved it. Some medical texts warned that too much thinking during the waking hour could lead to melancholy. Others claimed that spirits were more active during that window, and one should avoid going outside unless absolutely necessary. But even these warnings came with instructions. If you must go out, carry iron. Recite the Lord's Prayer. Avoid crossroads. Don't speak to anyone you can't clearly see. The return to bed was often gentle. People might lie awake a while, waiting for sleep to come again. Others had rituals, another prayer, a drink of water, turning the pillow. The second sleep tended to be lighter, more dream-filled. That was expected, and if one failed to return to sleep, that too was accepted. People might get up and start the day early. Farmers especially adjusted their schedules to light and need. There was no shame in rising at 3 a.m. if the cattle needed attention. No panic about missing sleep. That anxiety is modern. For them, sleep was functional, not fragile. By the 18th and 19th centuries, this biphasic pattern began to fade. Artificial lighting extended the day. Industrial schedules compressed time. The notion of proper sleep became more standardized. 8 hours in one go, preferably in silence. But for centuries before that, segmented sleep ruled, and with it came a rhythm that seems almost alien to us now, a rhythm of silence, pause, and breath in the heart of darkness. For modern sleepers, privacy is a given. Bedrooms are personal spaces, locked and insulated, sometimes even soundproofed. But in the medieval world, sleep was rarely solitary. It was social, uncomfortably so by our standards. You didn't just sleep beside your spouse. You slept beside your children, your servants, your guests, and sometimes total strangers. Let's start with the most common setup, the peasant household. Most families lived in a single-room dwelling. The bed, if there was one, was a shared space. Parents and children piled in together. Infants slept between adults, sometimes swaddled tightly, sometimes in makeshift cradles hanging near the fire. The warmth of the human body was more reliable than any hearth. Blankets were heavy and few. The more people beneath them, the better. There was no such thing as a kid's room. Everyone heard everything. Nighttime conversations were whispered over sleeping heads. Arguments, illnesses, childbirth. It all happened in that one shared space. This kind of collective sleeping wasn't considered uncomfortable. It was simply life, and it created bonds, but also tension. Privacy didn't exist, but neither did solitude. If someone died in their sleep, they were surrounded. If someone cried out from a nightmare, they were calmed or silenced. For the traveling poor, sleep was even less private. Inns were crowded, noisy, and unpredictable. Most didn't rent rooms in the way we imagine today. You rented a space in a bed, or simply a place near the hearth if the beds were full. Travelers often found themselves sleeping beside total strangers, feet to feet, back to back. Occasionally, the innkeeper would assign partners based on class or appearance, pairing like with like. This wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. A traveler who complained about a bedmate might be told to sleep in the stables instead, or to move on to the next village. And the beds themselves, often narrow, noisy, infested. Bedbugs weren't just a nuisance, they were a part of life, as were fleas, lice, and the occasional mouse nesting in the mattress stuffing. Even among the wealthy, bed sharing was common. Nobles and royalty often had large, ornate beds, but they weren't always used just for sleeping. They were platforms of display, spaces for ceremonial greetings, and symbols of power. Courtiers might wait in a noble's chamber while they dressed or prepared for bed. Attendants sometimes slept on stools or cushions nearby, ready to serve if needed. And among the elite, shared sleeping could be strategic. Ambassadors might share beds as a sign of trust, so might political allies. There are accounts of kings and visiting nobles sharing a bed, not for intimacy, but diplomacy. A bed was neutral ground, a place to talk without eavesdroppers, a space of unspoken negotiation. In monasteries, the situation was more uniform. Monks slept in dormitories, rows of narrow beds or pallets. Silence was enforced. Movements were minimal, and yet the sense of being surrounded by others never left. This closeness was spiritual. No one faced the darkness alone. In some convents, nuns also slept communally, but behind curtains or with wooden dividers. Modesty was observed more strictly in female religious orders. Still, the air was shared. The rhythm of breath and prayer filled the room. And then there were the hospitals. Medieval hospitals weren't sterile institutions. They were more like large hostels run by religious orders. Beds were lined in long halls. The sick lay side by side, sometimes 2 or 3 to a mattress. Care was minimal. Nurses and monks moved between the sick and the dying, offering broth, prayer, and comfort. But sleep was fragile. Pain, coughing, death, all happened in chorus. In prisons, sleep was punishment. Cells were overcrowded. Prisoners slept on stone floors, or, if they were lucky, on straw. Chains sometimes stayed on even at night. Rats were common, so were fights. A man might sleep with one eye open and a weapon in his hand. There was no safety, only exhaustion. Back in village homes, seasonal laborers often shared quarters. Entire groups of young men or women hired to work fields or tend animals, sleeping in barns or attics. These were the only times in life many would be away from their families, and the sleeping arrangements often mirrored that. Tight, noisy, full of whispered jokes and petty arguments. Interestingly, bed sharing also played a role in medicine. Healers sometimes advised a sick person to share a bed with a healthy one, believing the heat of the healthy body could balance the ill one. This wasn't just a theory, it was practiced. Mothers slept with feverish children. Spouses stayed close even when contagious. The idea of sleeping it off meant letting the body recalibrate beside someone strong. But with all this closeness came risk. Diseases spread rapidly. The plague, especially, devastated entire households who shared beds. Some tried to isolate the sick, most couldn't. And in the winter, when closing windows and packing bodies close together was the only way to stay warm, infection was nearly inevitable. Still, the social aspect of sleep didn't go away. It endured. People didn't sleep alone because they didn't live alone. They didn't compartmentalize sleep the way we do. Night was not a break from society. It was a different kind of participation in it. The idea of curling up in silence, in a dark room, undisturbed, that would have seemed odd, even undesirable. Sleep wasn't personal. It was communal. It was noisy, crowded, human. If you were sick in the Middle Ages, your doctor might tell you to sleep facing north. Avoid dreams of running water, or rub crushed herbs on your feet before bed. And as strange as it sounds now, this wasn't superstition. It was science, or at least the version of science they had. Sleep wasn't just a passive experience. It was an object of study, of warning, of deep suspicion. Physicians, monks, and natural philosophers all had opinions on what sleep meant for the body, the soul, and even the humors, the 4 bodily fluids believed to govern health. Let's begin with those humors. According to medieval medical theory, your body was composed of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Sleep affected the balance between them. Too much sleep? Your blood thickened and phlegm accumulated, making you sluggish. Too little sleep? The bile rose, causing anger, restlessness, even madness. Sleep was medicine. But the wrong kind of sleep? Poison. Medical manuscripts from the 12th to 15th centuries are full of sleep-related warnings. Don't sleep immediately after eating. It causes bad vapors to rise from the stomach to the brain. Don't sleep under the full moon. It invites madness. Don't sleep on your back. It crushes the lungs and invites demonic dreams. Don't sleep during the day unless you're very ill, because that reverses your blood and spoils your digestion. Pregnant women were told to sleep often, but not too deeply. Children needed long sleep to grow their bones, but not if they'd eaten beans. Those caused wind, which was thought to make the dreams wild. Even bedding had health implications. Feather mattresses were considered too soft. They made the spine crooked and the mind lazy. Wool was better. Straw was acceptable. But never sleep on raw animal hides. That was thought to bring foul humors and invite illness through the skin. Then there were the substances meant to control sleep. Poppy juice, a precursor to opiates, was widely known. It was used to sedate the restless and to ease the dying. Mixed with wine, it could knock a person out for hours. But it was dangerous, even in small doses. Many children died from poorly measured sleep potions administered by desperate parents. Valerian root was another common remedy, believed to calm the nerves and still the heart. Lavender, rosemary, and chamomile were often sewn into sleep pillows or burned in sick rooms. The scent was thought to cleanse the head and relax the mind. For nightmares, the cures were stranger. One remedy involved placing a live frog under your bed to absorb bad dreams. Another advised writing the name of Christ on a small piece of parchment and tucking it under your tongue before sleep. Still, others involved tying special knots in red string and circling the bed 3 times while reciting psalms. But behind all these practices was a single idea, that sleep could go wrong, that it wasn't a guaranteed refuge, but a threshold, a passage into a different state where the rules of waking life didn't apply. Nightmares weren't just unsettling, they were dangerous. A recurring dream might mean demonic oppression. Waking in terror? A sign your soul had been attacked. Sleepwalking. That was often taken as proof of possession or spiritual imbalance. Some people were even chained to their beds at night, not to protect others, but to protect themselves from wandering into danger while unconscious. And dreams themselves were decoded like holy messages. Dream of fire? Expect conflict. Dream of water? A coming illness. Dream of your teeth falling out? A death in the family. There were entire books devoted to dream interpretation, many of them mixing biblical stories with classical ideas from Aristotle and Galen. For instance, it was said that if you dreamed of flying east, you would receive divine news. If you dreamed of falling into mud, someone had cursed you. If you dreamed of wheat, your household would prosper. But if you dreamed of wolves, stay inside for 3 days. Violence was coming. These interpretations weren't considered frivolous. They were consulted before major decisions. Some kings even kept dream interpreters on staff. And then there were the sins of sleep. Laziness, oversleeping, sleeping during sermons, all were considered moral failings. The church often spoke of sloth, not just as laziness, but as a spiritual disease. To sleep too long was to deny God. To sleep too comfortably was to indulge the flesh. That's why monks slept on wooden boards. why ascetics chose the ground, why saints were praised for watching and praying through the night. Yet, paradoxically, sleep was also sacred. Christ himself slept during storms. Angels appeared in dreams. The Virgin Mary was sometimes depicted as guiding the sleeping faithful, and death itself was often described as the final sleep, a peaceful surrender into God's arms. So medieval people walked a line. They needed sleep to live, but they feared its temptations. They chased it, but also distrusted it. They treated it with medicine, with prayers, with rituals, and still it remained unpredictable. Some nights brought peace, others visions, others still. Nothing but silence and the echo of breath. But whether noble or poor, peasant or priest, everyone understood this. Sleep was never simple. It was a negotiation between body and soul, between day and night, between this world and what might wait in the next. So, after all this, after the candles have burned down, the herbs have been placed, the prayers whispered, and the bodies huddled close, what did medieval sleep truly mean? It wasn't just rest. It was something far more complex. It was survival. It was belief. It was ritual. And above all, it was a mirror of the world people lived in. We often imagine the past through the lens of daylight. Battles, markets, sermons, work in the fields. But the night reveals more. The way people slept tells us everything about their fears, their hopes, their understanding of the body and the soul. It's in the softness of shared straw, the tension of a blade beneath a pillow, the muttered verses in the dark. They feared what might come when the fire died, but they also saw sleep as a space to commune with God, to receive dreams, to touch the sacred. This duality between terror and transcendence is what defined their nights. Compare that to now. We draw blackout curtains, we buy weighted blankets, we wear silicone earplugs and track REM cycles with apps. We treat sleep as a science, a schedule, something to optimize, but we rarely treat it as a mystery. Medieval people had no such illusion of control. They knew that when you closed your eyes, you stepped into another world, that the body grew still, but the soul kept wandering, that dreams were not idle flashes, but messages, warnings, maybe even trials. Their sleep was broken, not just physically, into first and second slumbers, but also emotionally. There was no escape from their world, only a temporary shift in how it was experienced. They didn't sleep alone, because they didn't live alone, and they didn't sleep without fear, because fear was stitched into every part of life. Disease, fire, spirits, loss. It all crept in at night, but perhaps, strangely, there's something to be learned from them. From the way they built routine into vulnerability, from the way they respected rest. Not as laziness, but as something powerful, from the way they accepted waking at midnight not as failure, but as invitation. They listened to the quiet. They lit small flames. They moved slowly through the dark. They prepared their souls, and in that, maybe they slept better than we do. Not longer, not deeper, but more honestly, with the awareness that sleep is not a guarantee, that it can bring peace but also questions, that it is both an ending and a beginning. So, the next time you wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, thoughts racing, don't panic. You're not broken. You're human. You're closer to them than you think. Thank you for joining me in this quiet walk through the night. If you found something here, something strange, or peaceful, or simply curious, I invite you to subscribe. There are more stories waiting in the shadows. Until next time, sleep well, or at least sleep with a little wonder.